okay, let's be real for a second. Like, we're all busy these days, right? Figuring out, like, where to even put your focus, what actually deserves your energy when you're just, like, drowning in information and a million things to do, that's the real trick, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's not about magically getting like more hours in the day, but it's got to be about being way smarter with the hours we do have,
Oh.
you know? So how we cut through all the noise and zero in on what really truly matters.
And that actually brings us to something I think is going to be super useful for you, risk-based testing. And now I know the name might sound kind of technical at first, but trust me on this because at its heart, it's really all about prioritizing smartly, especially when you're dealing with big, complex projects and you just don't have unlimited time, which I'm guessing sounds pretty familiar.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And what's really cool about this whole risk-based thinking thing is that it's not just stuck in the world of software. It's this fundamental way of tackling like any situation where you got to make smart decisions, but you don't have unlimited resources.
Yeah.
It's like not just about squashing bugs, but it's this powerful lens to focus our limited attention on the stuff that can actually really hurt our goals, whether that's in software or any other big complex thing we're doing.
Exactly. So, for our deep dive today, we're going to explore risk-based testing using some really interesting research. And our mission is to give you a solid way to cut through all that noise and pinpoint what really, really matters.
Right. And at its core, risk-based testing, or RBT as people call it, is all about testing software where we really hone in on the areas that has the highest risk. So think of risks like those potential problems that could totally derail your project or product if we let them.
Yeah.
These risks could be technical, they could be business problems, or even stuff happening outside that we can't control.
Okay, so let's break this down even more. Why should you, the listener, actually care about this? Well, first, it's about making the most of your time and effort. You're making sure that the absolute most critical parts of whatever you're working on those get looked at first and get looked at the most thoroughly right. And second, it really lowers the chances of running into huge problems later on by finding and addressing those high-risk areas early on. It's like getting ahead of the game so you don't have to deal with major headaches later.
Right. And by putting our limited resources, I'm talking time, people, money, where they'll make the biggest difference. Risk-based testing just naturally leads to a way better overall quality in whatever we're building or delivering. And it's not just about the technical stuff. It also helps everyone involved see more clearly what's super vital for success. So everyone's making better decisions across the board.
Yeah, and to make this even more concrete, imagine you're testing like an online banking system, right? You've got the login feature where you put in your username and password, and then you've got the fund transfer feature where you're actually moving money between accounts. Now, obviously, both of those need to work, right? But think about what happens if they don't work. If the login fails, it's annoying.
Yeah.
You try again. But if the fund transfer fails, or even worse, it sends your money to the wrong person, well, that's a way bigger problem with some potentially serious financial consequences.
And it's interesting when you look at the difference in what could happen, the risk with the fund transfer is just way higher. So if you were using a risk-based testing approach, that's where you'd focus your energy first. The login, while it's important for getting in, would probably be lower priority at the beginning because if it fails, it's not as big of a deal.
Right. It's about focusing your energy where things could go wrong the most and where the impact of that would be the biggest. It makes sense when you put it like that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So now that we get why this approach is so valuable, the next question is how do we actually do it? How do we even find these risks? And then how do we figure out which ones need to be tackled first?
Exactly. And our research points out two main steps. First, figuring out what the risks actually are, and then second, deciding which ones are the most important.
So let's start with figuring out the risks first. And the research actually divides these into two main types, functional and non-functional. So functional risks are all about what the system actually does, the core things it's supposed to do, and how it behaves. This includes like those mission critical functions, the things that the product absolutely has to do to work.
Yeah.
I think about the most important ways that users are going to interact with it, and also think about those complex integrations where different parts of the system are connecting and sharing data. There's like different apps on your phone trying to talk to each other when they don't speak the same language.
Right.
Things can get messy, and these areas are usually more prone to having problems.
That makes sense. So like for an online store, a functional risk would be if the shopping cart doesn't add up the items, right? Or if the system just can't process your order after you paid. These directly affect whether the store can actually sell stuff.
Exactly. And then we've got non-functional risks. So these aren't about what the system does, but more about how well it does. This includes things like security vulnerabilities. Are there weaknesses that hackers could use, performance bottlenecks? Will the system slow down or crash? when a lot of people are using it at the same time, compliance stuff, does it meet all the legal and industry rules? And even just usability, is it hard or confusing for people to use?
So going back to that online store example, a non-functional risk could be like the website crashing on Black Friday because there's just too much traffic that's a performance bottleneck. Or it could be a flaw in how they're storing customer credit card info, making it easy to steal. That's a security vulnerability. Both would be a huge problem, even though they're not directly about browsing or adding stuff to your cart.
Exactly. And once we brainstormed and made this list of all the potential risks, both functional and non-functional, then we got to figure out how serious each risk is and how likely it is to actually happen.
So this is where we decide what gets the most attention right. We can't treat every single problem as equally urgent.
Right. And for that, the research talks about this really useful tool called a risk matrix. It's basically a simple grid that helps us visualize and prioritize risks. Imagine a square divided up into smaller boxes. On one side, we have impact, meaning how bad would it be if this risk actually happened? And on the other side, we have likelihood, meaning how likely is it that this risk will actually happen? And both impact and likelihood are usually rated as low, medium, or high.
Okay, so picture this matrix. A risk that's high impact and high likelihood, that's the one that should be setting off all the alarms, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's up in the top right corner of our matrix, the danger zone. These are the risks that could cause the most damage and are the most likely to happen. So those are our top priorities. For testing, on the other hand, a risk that's low impact and low likelihood, we might not need to worry about that one right away.
So it's a system for looking at each problem and asking two questions. How bad would it be if this happened, and how likely is it to actually happen in the first place?
Exactly. And the risk matrix just gives us a clear way to organize all this info and make smart choices about where to focus our limited testing time. It helps us move past just guessing what's important and gives us a structured, logical approach to prioritizing.
This makes a lot of sense. So we figured out what the problems could be and which ones are the most important and likely to happen. What do we actually do with that information? How do we apply this risk-based thinking to our testing?
So that brings us to the actual techniques for doing risk-based testing.
Yeah.
The research highlights three main techniques that actually put all this risk stuff into action.
Okay, I'm running. What's the first one we need to know about?
The first one is risk-based test design. This is all about how we actually plan and create our tests. The idea is that we focus our energy on designing tests for the features or areas that we've already figured out are the highest risk. This might mean we spend more time creating detailed and thorough tests for these critical areas.
So like with that online banking example, we'd spend way more time thinking about and writing very thorough tests just for that fund transfer feature. We'd cover all kinds of scenarios like transferring to different types of accounts, trying to transfer more money than you're allowed, what happens when there's error messages, every possible angle.
Exactly. And another big part of risk-based test design is using exploratory testing for risks that are harder to predict sometimes, especially in systems that are really complex. We just can't foresee every single problem exploratory testing, where testers are learning about the system, designing tests, and running them all at the same time can be super helpful for uncovering those less obvious but still potentially high-risk issues. Think about a healthcare app, for example. We know that patient data security is a huge risk, but exploratory testing might show us unexpected ways that data could be accessed or mishandled. It's like having detectives investigating the most vulnerable areas. That makes sense. It's like we're focusing our investigative work on the areas where the most trouble could happen. So what's the second technique? The second one is risk-based test execution. This one's all about the order in which we actually run our tests. The main idea here is to start by testing those supercritical functions early on in the testing process that way. If there are big problems in those high-risk areas, we find out about them quickly, which saves us a ton of time and effort in the long run.
So we wouldn't wait till the very end of testing to check if the most important stuff is actually working.
Nope. We want feedback on the riskiest stuff right away. The research also talks about how useful it is to use automation for testing high-risk areas over and over again if we know something is both critical and has had problems in the past. Automating the tests for it means we can run those checks all the time throughout development. And lastly, risk-based test execution means prioritizing what's called regression testing on those high-risk features. Regression testing is basically just retesting things that were working fine before after we make a change to the system, just to make sure we didn't break anything when we update the system. We want to be super sure that those critical high-risk areas are still working perfectly.
That's smart. So if we updated the payment system on our online store, the first things we'd automate and regression test would be those actual payment steps, not just whether a new banner on the homepage looks right.
Exactly. The focus stays on the parts where if they failed, it would be a really big deal. And then there's the third key technique,
The third one is continuous risk assessment. This sounds like it's not just a one-time thing, but something we keep doing.
You got it. Risk is not a set it and forget it thing. It changes as we move forward. New features get added. The environment we're working in might change, and we learn new things as we go. Continuous risk assessment means looking at and updating our risk priorities based on this new information. This could involve having regular meetings about risk with everyone involved just to get different perspectives and make sure everyone agrees on what the current high-risk areas are. And the research really highlights how important this is in agile environments where things are changing quickly. We should reevaluate the risks after each sprint or iteration to make sure our testing is still focused on the most relevant threats.
So it's this ongoing feedback loop, right? We figure out the risks, prioritize them, test based on that, and then we go back and look at the risks again based on what we've learned and what's changed. This makes sure our testing is aligned with the actual risks all the way through.
Exactly. It's about being flexible and responding to those potential problems as they change.
Okay, this has been super helpful. So to recap for our listener, risk-based testing is all about being strategic when you don't have unlimited resources. It's about recognizing that we're all busy and making smart choices about where to focus our energy by figuring out what could cause the biggest problems.
And we talked about the two fundamental steps. First, identifying those risks, both functional, what the system does, like those critical features and complex integrations, and non-functional, how the system performs, like security problems and performance issues. And then we prioritize these risks by looking at how bad the impact would be and how likely they are to happen, often using that risk matrix with the low, medium, and high categories for both.
And finally, we talked about the three main techniques to actually put risk-based testing into practice, risk-based test design, where we really focus on creating tests for the high-risk areas, risk-based test execution, where we prioritize testing and automating those critical functions, and continuous risk assessment, where we're constantly revisiting and updating our risk priorities as the project moves along.
And what's cool is how these three techniques work together to create this comprehensive approach to testing that's both efficient and super effective at focusing on what truly matters.
I agree. It's not about testing less. It's about testing smarter and focusing your energy where it will actually make a difference. So as you're going through your day, think about how this idea of identifying and prioritizing risks could apply to other parts of your work or even your personal life, where you're always making choices about what to spend your time on, what would be like your equivalent of a high impact, high likelihood risk in a completely different scenario. It's a really powerful way to think about things.
I think so too.
Thanks for listening.